I wrote all of your questions down in my handy dandy little notebook. The first question somebody wanted to make sure that I covered is, why does the crust slide down the sides of the pan when you put it in the oven? I generally think that that's a two-part answer to that question. Part number one is that your crust isn't quite thick enough perhaps, and or it's too soft. So the first thing that happens when you throw it in the oven is that the shortening or the butter or the lard or whatever you're using melts, and everything just kind of like gets lubricated and slides right down into the bottom. So that's one issue. And the other issue is pie pans generally come, well, just like this bowl, with a lip on them. And you want to make sure that when you line your pan with your dough, that it comes all the way out to the edge and even past the edge of this lip. That way it gives it kind of a shelf to sit on, to set up, and it'll keep your crust from sliding down in. So that is my answer to that question. Question number two, how chilled does the crust have to be before you actually toss it in the oven? I think the colder the better. I generally freeze mine for at least 30 minutes before I throw it in the oven. You can also line your pan, freeze it, and bake the next day, but I like to bake from frozen. The longer you can keep your fat solid, the less chance you're going to have of it sliding down into the bottom of your pan. Okay, how do you keep the edges from burning? Well, I think thing number one has to do also with the thickness. You want to make sure that your edges are thick enough that it's going to take them a while to get brown. But even so, sometimes you'll be getting a little bit too brown on the edges. Personally, I think that Americans tend to underbake their pastries. I think that we can let things get a lot more caramelized than sometimes we're willing to go. If you look at croissants made in the United States versus croissants that are made over in Europe, generally the European ones are much darker in color, and that adds the flavor. So unless you're like bordering on seriously mahogany scorched, I think that you're probably okay as long as you're just at sort of a deep golden brown color. If you are concerned, they make those little pie crust shield things. I wouldn't bother. I would just, and instead of trying to put foil all around the edges and end up burning yourself and all that kind of crazy stuff, I would just tent the whole guy with a big tent of foil, but that's just me. So anyway, so there's that. There's a question about the fat that you use. What fat should you use? Why should you use that fat? And is there a difference in the way you should handle the dough depending on what fat you use? Well, first of all, let's look at the different fats that you can use. Solid fats, you can use shortening, you can use butter, you can use lard, you can use any combination of those three, even all three of them in combination. Liquid fats, you can use oil. That's a different kind of pie crust. That pie crust, the pie crust that's made with oil isn't one that you really roll out, it's one that you kind of pat in the pan, sort of like Play-Doh, so, and it makes a very tender crust. So we're going to look really at solid fat pie crusts today. I generally use all butter just because I prefer the flavor. The little bit of a downside of butter is that there is a water content in the butter, about 18% in butters made in the United States. And that, of course, contributes to the overall amount of water. So you have to keep that in mind. If you're changing a recipe and you want to, it was designed to be made with shortening or lard, and you decide you're going to use butter instead, you have to keep in mind the fact that 18% of the weight of that butter is actually water. So you're going to have to subtract the amount of water from your water measurement to account for the water that's in the butter. I hope that makes sense. Sometimes I do not express myself very well. So anyway, so there's that. Let's see. Lard, I have never worked with lard. I think it's intriguing. First of all, people have been baking pie crust with lards forever. The crystals in the fat in lard are very large, So when you make a pie crust with lard, you end up with lots of flakes because the fat kind of stays in relatively large pieces. There's also no water content there, so in that way lard and shortening are comparable. Lard, however, even though it's a solid, is a much healthier fat for you than any kind of a hydrogenated vegetable shortening like, well, you know the brand names. So, so there's that to keep in mind as well. As far as handling, everything should be as cold as possible. Each of those fats has a range at which it stays solid, not too solid that you can't work it, but solid enough that it's not going to melt into your flour. Those ranges all tend to overlap somewhere around the 65 to 70 2-3-ish degree range. So as long as that's your target temperature, you don't really have to do too much tweaking with the way that you handle the different fats. As far as handling the dough, gentler is always better regardless of the fat that you use. So anyway, I hope that that answers that question. The best thing to use for blind baking, I have read everything from beans to pennies to buying ceramic pie weights, or they've got these pie chains that you snake around and stick in the bottom of your pie crust and all this kind of stuff. For me, what I have found to be the most useful, because they're small and they're regularly shaped, are actually dried chickpeas. Some beans, like kidney beans, if you use those, which work, they smell terrible when you put them in the oven. It's really quite unpleasant. I was a little disturbed. But the chickpeas don't have an appreciable odor when you throw them in the oven. I don't know, they're just so hard to begin with. And also, as far as lining your pie crust before you put your weights in, there are a couple of different ways to go with that. I've seen people use big coffee filters, crumble up a piece of parchment paper and then spread it out again and fit that into your pan. People use foil, that release foil works really well. For me, I like to use saran wrap. I know you think that's kind of crazy putting saran wrap in the oven, but it works really, really well. It molds very easily to the shape of your pan, and as long as you don't let it hit metal, if you're using a metal pan, or you don't let it hit the rack in the oven, you're going to be fine. And what happens as it gets hot is the edges of it tend to shrink a little bit. So by the time your blind baking is done, you take out your pie crust and you basically have this little bag of beans that you can just lift out very, very easily. So I always vote to go with saran wrap. It has just worked really well for me. I learned that you could put it in the oven in culinary school. I was very pleased to learn that. So I'm passing that along to you. The person who asked this question wanted to know if it was okay if there were little indentations from the beans or whatever you're using as your weights. Yeah, that's just one of those things that happens. I really wouldn't worry about it. You can minimize that, of course, by freezing your crust before blind baking, and that way your crust is hard. It starts out hard anyway, and so that will minimize the dimpling that can happen from the beans or whatever that you're using for blind baking. How do you keep your pie crust from shrinking? I wrote a whole post on this, of probably 2 or maybe even 3 posts about keeping your pie crust from shrinking. The big ones are to make sure that the gluten is as relaxed as possible. You want to let it rest a lot in between rolling. You also don't want to stretch it when you're putting it in the pan. Every time you stretch the pie crust, the gluten says, oh, hello, it's time for me to do my thing, and it wants to be all boingy. So when you fit it in the pan, I'm going to pretend this is the pie pan. When you fit the crust in the pan, you want to, I just do it from frozen. And I stick the frozen sheet of pie dough on the pan and then just let it thaw right into the pan. And once it starts to slump down in the bottom, you very, very gently just press it in the bottom, and then you lift up your excess, and then you fit it in the sides all the way up without any stretching. If you stretch it, just let it bounce back. You don't want to like pull it up the sides and like stick it to the, no, because that's going to just end up pulling back. So anyway, just lay it in very gently. Make sure that your crust is plenty big enough so you don't feel like you need to stretch the dough. And again, freeze it before you bake it. And those are the main things. Also water. Water is a huge issue. Most people use too much water when they make their pie crust, and the more water you have, the more likely you are to end up activating too much gluten, no matter how gentle you are, and then you end up with a sticky, horrible mess that refuses to roll out, and then you sweat and you cry and you curse, and it's just no fun. So the less water you can use, the better. When you'll see when I make it, when the dough is actually ready, you're going to say there is no way that dough is ready. What is wrong with her? But trust me, over time the flour hydrates and sucks up the water and goes from looking dry and stupid to perfect in about half an hour resting in the refrigerator. So just use a real light touch with your water. And those are all the... Oh, here's a question I thought was very, very interesting. Somebody asked, what about the boiling water pie crust? I was like, boiling water pie crust? I have not heard of this. So I went and read about it. I just read the ingredient list, and it's shortening and boiling water and a little bit of milk, salt, and flour. And that's all that's in it. So it's like a basic pie crust. The difference being that you take the shortening and the hot water and the little bit of milk, and you beat them together with your fork until you basically have an emulsion. You're going to end up with something that looks kind of like whipped cream. The water is suspended in the fat in the shortening. So since you've got the water droplets suspended evenly throughout the fat, I believe the milk must have some sort of emulsifier in it that allows that emulsification to happen. And then you mix it with the flour and the salt. The fat is going to be evenly distributed, and since there's more fat than water, the fat is also going to coat the flour, giving you a tender crust, and the water also will be evenly distributed in the fat. So it's kind of foolproof. The way I make mine, you'll see I pour a little water in. Just because of the way I add the water, there's going to be parts of the dough that are a little bit wetter and parts that are a little bit drier. But if you do an emulsion first, then the water is evenly dispersed, and I think it's probably a bit easier to deal with. It seems like a really old recipe. All of the recipes that I read online appeared to be, from, oh, this is my grandmother's or my great-grandmother's recipe, and it's foolproof, and she swears by it. I say that if you want to give it a shot, definitely go for it. I've not played with it before. I might, just to see. I will say that I like the pie crust that I'm going to make for you today. It's just a standard French pâte brisée, which is a pretty flaky crust. The fat is 100% butter. What else do I want to say about this? Oh, and you can make it a little bit sweeter or a little bit less sweet just by the amount of sugar that you add. So it's pretty versatile as well. So anyway, I hope that takes care of that. I'm going to get set up, and we are going to weigh and make some pie crust. All right, thanks guys.